Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well. So I just wanted to speak about a couple of less talked about fears when it comes to ROCD. Now with ROCD, of course, you've got some of the more common ones. So the fear of being in the wrong relationship, or the fear of losing connection, and the fear of not being happy in your relationship. And there's also another couple of ones that can really bubble away under the surface that we're not always aware of, and definitely some things that I struggle with too. So firstly, you've got the fear of disgust. Now with ROCD, what can happen is the sufferer has this disgust sensation towards their partner, and it can feel generally like that, just that sense of ickiness, that disgust. With me, it used to be that pit in the bottom of my stomach, that almost like sicky feeling where every time that I would be with someone, there would be that general ickiness, just that feeling of being in disgust. And every time you saw them, whether it was like a certain feature or like a certain mannerism or a certain behavior, what would happen was the ROCD would really exacerbate that, and you genuinely feel that sense of that disgust and ickiness towards them, to the point where you'd actually find it quite hard to look them in the eye, to the point where also you would find it easier to avoid them. And generally, it'd put a strain in the relationship, because it would just be that strong sensation of just not feeling very good in yourself. There were times as well when I would even feel like very sick, to the point of me throwing up, and I definitely did do that. So like with many other fears, we have to get comfortable with those sensations that brings up. There can be a fear element there, which says, well, what if I'm stuck with this relationship, stuck with this feeling of disgust in my relationship forever? Surely it would just be easier for me just to leave the relationship, because I can't stand it being there. So you're going to have to really break down that sensation in terms of the fear of fear and that being stuck forever. And you also need to look at the other fears around that as well. So because I feel this disgust sensation, does that mean that I'm not going to be as happy in my relationship? Does that mean that I'm not going to have those feelings of connection that that I want to have? So there can also be those actual fears stemming from that. There's also the fear of fear element, and that actually being there forever. Okay, so you really need to work on that. And there will be things that you avoid around that as well, right? So for example, you might not give your partner certain compliments or say I love you, because you're operating from that lens of disgust and ickiness. Maybe there'll be times where you don't want to take your partner out, you and them with some friends, because you don't want to maybe put extra pressure on that relationship, and you know that those discomfort sensations are going to be exacerbated. You might avoid intimacy because, again, you just can't stand that being there. So what you have to do is, when that's really happening, you have to run the risk at times. You're going to be running the risk that you are living a lie. You're going to have to run the risk of doing those little exposures, for example, where you do say, oh, you look good today, or I really like this certain trait or characteristic about you, even though internally you're saying, oh, it looks really wrong. Trying to make sure you go to these things with them and your friends, just to expose yourself to that as well, and run the risk of putting that pressure on him. So you need to think about all of those things and all of those behaviors, whilst also you're breaking down that actual fear of being disgusted and those sensations that arise from that. And also, you do of course need to work on those other fears around that, because the fear of disgust can also stem from being in the wrong relationship as well. So also you need to work on that. But having said that, it's very specific on a case by case basis. It does need that extra pair of eyes when it does come to that sort of one-to-one coaching. All right, so it's something to be really aware of there. So you've got that that fear of disgust and ickiness. And the thing is, what you might be doing, you might be trying to chase that internal peace as well, where you have that internal sense of, oh, I feel satisfied with my partner, that internal satisfaction that makes you feel connected and everything else. And again, it's realizing that we might not ever have that complete satisfaction. There will be times, ROCD or not, where we can have those periods in the relationship where we do feel a bit wrong towards a partner, that wrong sensation, that feeling of wrongness. And we do have to push through with that at times. Like I said, exposing yourself to those moments when it feels like you want to avoid the most, those can be really good little exposures where, for example, you have the intimacy, or you compliment them, or you do those things you have to do, and yeah, it's going to feel like you're living a complete lie at times and you are being a bit of a fraud. But unfortunately, that's the risk we have to take with our OCD, because what's the other option? The other option is to not try at all, and just be stuck with OCD forever, right? So yeah, that's really important to remember when it comes to discuss, and also the other acceptance is going to come into question there. Looking at how you're rating other people, and seeing if you can have that compassion, and not putting them on these rigidly high demands and standards that you put in your mind. You need to think, right, how can I gradually think about releasing that and actually accepting them for who they are, for their different mannerisms, for their different traits. And like I said, really getting comfortable with those sensations, that that sick sensation, that pit of the stomach where it just feels wrong, so you need to be aware of that. Okay. And then another feeling as well, what can also, really exacerbate that, is that fear of feeling trapped as well. Okay, that trapped sensation where it's like you have that wrong sensation, and the sickness and the pit of the stomach and whatever else, but it also feels like you're trapped in the sense that, what if I'm missing out on something better? Surely it would just be easier for me to leave the relationship, to get out of this situation and to get out of this discomfort. And of course, it's not to say that you can't ever leave a relationship. No, like you can do that. It is your call at the end of the day, but you have to be aware that if you do leave the relationship, that you could be stoking the OCD bear, that you could be stoking the avoidance fire. And actually what could happen is that same sensation just follows you into the next relationship, and you also run the risk of losing the current relationship because OCD is pulling the strings. So what you want to do is, the best advice we can give is trying to stay in that relationship. Try and get comfortable with those uncomfortable sensations, breaking down those core fears pertaining to those sensations and the actual relationship. And then, further down the line, more than likely, you'll be in a better position to make a decision on the relationship. We're not saying you're going to completely get certainty and see the wood from the trees, but whilst your belief systems are still very rigid and you've got all these compulsions and everything else going on, it wouldn't make sense to make a decision on the relationship there, only down the line when you've really worked on these things. Okay, so yeah, just more on that fear of being trapped. It's like, what if I'm missing out on something better? I could be missing out on having sexual variety. I could be missing out on having a better partner. I could be happier elsewhere. Because of those feelings of disgust that your partner gives you, it can just make it feel like, miserable in your relationship, and that you need to find that release and you need to find that outlet. And, what you really need to think about here is, the significance of a relationship in the context of your life. Okay, let's say you was missing out on another sexual experience because you felt trapped. Okay, what are you really missing out on, right? The sensation of sex, generally speaking, can feel the same from person to person, right? Yes, the person might have different traits and characteristics, but generally speaking, the fundamentals are fairly similar, right? The sensations of sex, the fundamentals of a relationship, just intimacy and doing activities together and meeting their friends and whatever. Like, generally speaking, the fundamentals are the same. So what am I really missing out on there? It's having that sexual variety as well. Is that always what it's cracked up to be, right? You could say that could also have its challenges as well, because when you want to have that sexual variety, aka being single, doesn't always guarantee you're going to get that, because you have to, when you're single, it's not always there for you. You have to go out and get the intimacy, right? There can be challenges that come from that. Different people with different traits, they're not just going to be completely perfect and sort of a walk in the park, so to speak. No, they're going to have their down things as well. They're going to have their bad traits and characteristics as well. But OCD will really fabricate that and think, well, the grass is always going to be greener. Okay, so we have to accept that, even though we think we can want sexual intimacy, again, there's pros and cons, right? There's pros and cons to relationships. There's pros and cons to having more sexual variety, aka being single. Okay, so you really need to weigh that up when it comes to those fears. And when we say like fear of being trapped as well, like, it really implies that the relationship is just the only important part of your life, right? But in reality, it's a part of life and not life itself. When we have that feeling of being trapped, we're giving that dismal over importance to the relationship. Okay, we're saying that it's everything, whereas it isn't everything. We've got our physical health, we've got friends, we've got family, we've got our work, hobbies and interests. We need to start seeing relationships as part of that pie, a slice of that pie, rather than the whole pie itself. And that's why ROCD and these feelings of disgust and these feelings of missing out and being trapped. That's why they have that extra kick, because we put so much weightage and importance on the relationship that any decision relating to that feels like life and death. Okay, so that was one of the best things that I really did do, really trying to break down the importance of the relationship in the context of one's life. And naturally, as you do that, there's less fertile ground for compulsions to thrive. There's less fertile ground for intense and chronic feelings to really thrive as well, because it just doesn't have that same kick, because you've brought down the importance of the relationship in the context of one's life. Okay, so yeah. What also can happen as well, you can have that sort of anger as well, and that hatred and resentment towards your partner because you feel trapped and you feel a bit disgusted. What can happen is you might have some compulsions where you're trying to like control them, and maybe like the things that they wear or like the things that they do. You feel that inner resentment, and you can really again, like snap towards them and be pretty unpleasant. Okay, so again, you need to be looking at how important the relationship is in the context of one life. And you also need to try and really work on your other acceptance of the partner, and still realise that even if he was trapped in a relationship, even if he was stuck with this sense of disgust or that sickness in your stomach, again, you could still try and make the best of it, right? You could still eat good food, you could still travel, you could still have companionship, you could still have the combination of monetary incomes. There could still be some pros that actually do come from the relationship there, right? It wouldn't just have to be cons because of a feeling, right? And of course, with ROCD, like we really do try and base it off of a feeling alone, whereas in reality, you need to look at the bigger the picture, because the gut can very much be hijacked when it comes to ROCD. So you need to try and think about things other than just feeling. As Nick always says, it can always be actions as well, and like just the wider picture of your life around that relationship other than just a feeling. Okay, so yeah, some of those less talked about fears when it comes to ROCD there.